but I really do think it's important because we spend a lot of time teaching students Hebrew grammar or historical matters, but very rarely are our big disagreements actually come down to you looked up kind of hell it wrong. Sometimes, but often it's not at the level of sentence or kind of semantics. It's often these bigger picture issues like what is a poem? How are we meant to read a law? Or what is how do you work out the ethical framework for a story? And those things, because they're so automatic and assumed, we end up in these really nasty kind of debates where we talk past each other a lot because we haven't gone down to the core of our disagreement, which is what is this thing that we're reading and how does it work? And so that's why genre has become for me an unhealthy obsession, which I'm seeking help for, but it's a slow road.
You've got this therapy where you've worked out these issues, and right. I mean it's part of us, right? You have to exercise the demons that are stirring you, right? So, and I noticed the people you just named that were in that literature department are people who show up a lot in the footnotes of the book as well. And you were trained as a lawyer as well, which maybe you told me at some point in conversation, but I did not remember that. So. We'll come back to law later. Maybe give us a quick instance of genre misinterpretation or a conflict of genres that you commonly see in biblical interpretation. Maybe even just at the the church level.
Yeah. So I mean, from the kind of a very small example would be mistaking some of the like I was in a Bible study group, like a church Bible study with normal, everyday real human beings, not Bible scholars. And someone picked up from one of Paul's letters this phrase, "I want you to know." And went on this big kind of like, how important knowledge is to Paul, and like, really the heart of the Christian life is kind of understanding and knowing stuff. Now, all those things are true and good, but also, "I want you to know" is just how you introduce the next dot point in a letter. So it's not actually that important to his point. He just is moving on to the next topic. But I want you to know, I guess if you haven't read a lot of papyrus kind of letters, now the stakes there are quite low. But I think a really common one where the stakes are much higher is in how we evaluate characters and the ethical framework in narratives, because I think we often assume that the Bible stories are exemplar, like they're designed to sort of here is a great patriarch, go do likewise, and that becomes kind of a bit kind of hairy when you get to some of the Bible stories. Say in the book of Judges, I spent a lot of time in my doctoral studies in Judges 19.
That is a grand understatement. Okay, so I need to warn our listeners who are not from the British colonies. That a bit, I mean, even just in the book of Genesis, right? Most of what Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob do, we want to say, don't do that, right? So by the time we get to Judges, we're pretty well warmed up with the non-exemplarist view. Sorry, I had to interrupt you, but I just realized that people were not picking up what you were laying down there.
Yeah, well, I mean,
don't be subtle. We have a lot of Americans listening to this. So.
They do some very bad things. So we'll back to Genesis before we even get to Judges. That's a good example too, right? Because you have Abraham, great man of faith, who also owns slaves. Now, in a lot of pre-Civil War sermons that I've read, and I kind of looked through like speeches to Congress, they make the point, well, Abraham had slaves, so we can too. He's a great man of steel, God's athlete, heroic man of faith. And so the fact that he and Sarah have Hagar, and the fact that then in the story of Hagar, Genesis 16, Hagar is sent back to her mistress under her hand. Well, that's why not only is it okay to have slaves, but actually the fugitive slave law is commanded by God, right? You have to send the angel says it very clearly. Now, what's going on there? Is it that people are reading that story in bad faith? Well, maybe. To be honest, maybe there's they want the Bible to mean what they want it to mean. But my hunch was actually it's a difference also of just because it happens in the narrative, does that mean that we're meant to do it or not? Now, in a fairy tale like The Boy Who Cried Wolf, do you have that story in North America?
Yep,
Yeah,
we
you've
do.
got
Yeah,
me second
absolutely.
guessing myself.
No, no, no.
Yeah, we do have some common culture. And Boy Who Cried Wolf, it's very clear what you meant to do with that story, and it's very clear that the ethical, that the characters are very simple, and the ethical point is very, very straightforward. But is the Bible full of fairy tale stories which are simply, here's a story about a runaway slave, so that's why slaves shouldn't run away?
Yeah. Don't be a
Now, I
runaway
happen to think, yeah, don't be a runaway slave. Now, if you think about that for a moment, there's nothing you can do to persuade someone out of that reading of the story
right.
if they have that genre in mind. So it's not at the level of like, well, have you considered this linguistic argument, or you considered this kind of fact of the text? We're talking cross purposes, because if you think that that fundamentally, unless the narrator condemns an action, if Abraham does it, it must be good. Like if that's your overriding sense of how narratives work, we can't help each other. We can't talk. So that's maybe a good example. Or
Hey there, if you've benefited from this content at all, please hit the like and subscribe, or subscribe and like, one of those or both of them together on this video. It helps us tremendously with the math algorithm nerd monsters.
I mean, Judges 19, which I spent a lot of time in.
Right.
So I've given you 3 examples, sorry, but
Judges 19, which is a parallel to Genesis 19, right?
yeah. So the story where the young woman who's has the misfortune of being married to the Levite is brutally raped, murdered, and dismembered. The history of interpretation of that is a bit bad. To understand, it's possibly worse than the story itself, right? Because you literally have people going, well, what was she wearing when she went into Gibeah that led to this treatment? Because it's like, well, there must be a moral to this story because it's an exemplum. So this is a story about how you shouldn't leave your husband, or you shouldn't, dress inappropriately when going into a Benjaminite town. Now, I have problems with that reading, to put it mildly, and I think it begins life that those problems, which is all the way through the history of reception, right? This is if you want to sleep well at night, don't do the reception studies on Judges.
Done.
Yeah, just stay away from stay away. That's not good for your sleep or your faith in Bible scholars. And these unspoken assumptions about what a narrative in Judges particularly is trying to do, because the narrator often doesn't help you out. The narrator doesn't go, and that was a very bad thing that he did.
Yeah, not until you get to the Book of Kings, where finally they're saying, and that was evil in the eyes of Yahweh, right?
Yes, just tell me what I meant to think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's more like, how I teach it for my students, it's much more like a good film. And a good film doesn't it doesn't have too much exposition telling you exactly what to think. It shows rather than tells. And I think that's how Hebrew narrative usually works. But if you don't have that subtle appreciation for what the narrator's doing, you can end up, I think, really doing injustice not only to the young woman in that story, or to Hagar in Hagar's story, but you can do injustice to the text of Scripture, because it becomes an immoral text at some point.
Right.
Like, it just becomes awful.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably one of the most common confusions I get in class, especially I was a children's pastor for for a few years, and what they call the Vacation Bible School curriculum, or the children's curriculum, when they did it on the judges, every single judge was celebrated except for Jephthah. Even Samson was posed as an exemplar of how you should behave and act. And you have a great example in the book, which I actually stopped reading and went and watched the YouTube video of John Piper.
Yes.
And you're right, because he's like, oh, this is so cringy. And I was like, how cringy could it be? And you're right, it is horribly cringy, but it's a perfect example of he's trying to have a very dead serious conversation about sin. And the audience, had probably been having fun and maybe even had a half comedian up on stage before him or something. The audience was primed for sarcasm. And so it actually became, you could see he's like visibly disturbed by the fact that they're laughing as he's talking about his sin. Just when you described it, I was a little confused. I was like, wait, how are they laughing at these words? And then once you watch the video, you see, oh, I get it. Yeah, it reads like a deadpan. He looks like, I don't know if you know Stephen Wright, the old comedian, just kind of standing up there doing one-liners, right? So this is a real problem. So maybe we should go ahead and stop here and give your working definition of genre.
So my working definition of genre is genres are conventions that writers and readers use to get things done or make meaning in some contexts, in some situations, but not in others. And so each of those bits we could kind of unpack. But the key kind of thing that you don't hear there is I'm not giving you any metaphor. Most metaphors for genre, like metaphors for the Trinity, are deeply misleading. So I call them conventions because that's kind of what they are. Like we drive on the left side of the road in Australia, you drive, I understand, on the right. It almost kills me every time I
Everybody in
visit
the
SBL.
world drives on the
Sorry.
right side of the world,
Sorry.
except for the British Commonwealth. So, like, don't pick
Yeah,
on
I beg your
America.
pardon. I beg your pardon. So you drive on the correct side of the road, obviously.
The majority.
Yeah, that's right. The majority rule. So it's a convention. It's a thing that exists. It's bigger than any one individual subjectivity. But also, if I forget that convention when I'm in America, I quickly die. So the payoffs for not coordinating on that convention. There's quite a robust philosophical explanation of how conventions work and how they arise. But I think it's useful. Now, the problem with calling genre a convention, though, is that every aspect of language is also a convention. So the rules of the English language are conventional. The reason why the words I use mean what they mean is not because of some deep fact about the universe. It's just because that's how we have always spoken. It's the way we do things here. And there's no incentive for you or me to suddenly redefine the word the. It's just not workable. And the payoffs for coordinating on that are such. So how is genre different from any other convention of English language or language? And that's where the in some situations caveat comes into play. And that's, I think, in some ways the most important thing to understand about genres. The reason why John Piper, in the example you were referring to before, and his audience can speak English and perfectly understand each other's English and yet completely misunderstand what they're doing in terms of the level of genre is because sometimes we joke around, but sometimes we're deadly serious. It depends on the situation. And as someone who's I'm married to someone who doesn't get sarcasm. I'm the most sarcastic person in my family. It's very hard to convince someone you're not being sarcastic. Like the harder you dig in, the worse it becomes. No, honey, I really, really think that dress looks great on you. No, I'm not being sarcastic. I would never lie to you about it. I mean, you dig in and things just become worse. And that's the tricky thing about genre. If I'm speaking English, the rules of English grammar always apply. But sometimes when I'm speaking English, I'm also telling a joke or being sarcastic. Sometimes I'm trying to give a compliment. Sometimes I'm writing a story. Sometimes I'm writing a poem. Sometimes I'm having a laugh. Sometimes I'm writing a parking ticket. The different situations bring with them different social purposes and different rules. And those different genres can cancel out every other level of grammar, syntax, vocabulary. All the other rules are on the table based on what genre you're in. And that's why that crucial bit about in some situations but not other situations is where that's the sting in the tail of genre, because it messes us up. It really has a lot to answer for. I think we should abolish it.
Yeah. It reminds me of, I remember hearing a radio story on etiquette, and it was somebody who surveyed, dozens of tourist guides, like these books, Fodor's Visiting Italy or whatever. But they looked at all the ones that were for people in the majority world coming to the United States. Actually, some of them were Japanese. It's like people from very non-Western, as they call it, locales. And, some of the findings were things like people didn't know when you were supposed to use your fingers for food in the United States versus when you're supposed to use a fork and a knife, and points out if they're deep fried potatoes and cut and rectangularly, then you can use your fingers, no problem. But if they're whole potatoes or roasted, then you have to use a fork, and they said,
Yes.
you don't, some people were surprised to find out that you don't need to bring cash when you go over to someone's house for dinner and leave it in their bedroom. We do this in America. Even
We
things
do
like
that in
tipping.
Australia. Just next time you visit, Drew, you should leave cash on my pillow.
I will bring all the Iraqi dinars that I can find and leave them in your bedroom. And So it seems like you're talking about this kind of, it's a very loose, difficult to discern when you're not used to the palette of genres as well, because each culture, when I first lived in the UK, I found out that they didn't know that Americans could also be sarcastic, because I'm also fluent in sarcasm. Me and my wife have a safe word in sarcasm, so I can
That's a
let her
great
know when
idea.
I'm actually being serious.
It's a great idea.
um, yeah. And so I guess you can see the problem on the horizon and address it in the book is, well, we if we want to figure these out today, I can just go to Australia, live there, have you explain to me these little etiquettes and details and the types of literature we're reading. But we can't do that with the biblical literature, right? We can't go back and say, and here's the etiquette for how you read. Even Jesus' parable of Lazarus and the rich man. The number of people who have been shocked when I said, "Well, yeah, this is a parable. It comes from Egypt and it makes its way into to Jewish sectors, and then Jesus modifies it once again." But I think if I read you correctly, that's a failure to see the appropriate genre there. So you actually think he's describing heaven and hell, which I have to point out. Like, if that's what you think heaven is, man, I don't want to go.
Sure.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
so how are we going to figure out this economy of genres in a world that the only literature we have from that world is the literature that we have
Yeah. Yeah.
in the Old Testament?
We're perpetually on the first day off the plane in a new country, aren't we? We're like we just have we're at the airport maybe,
Right.
and now I think like there are some ways to navigate that. One of my mantras with this when I'm teaching Old Testament is we just have to be good travelers. Like don't be a boring traveler. And if you
Mm.
ever travel with a really tiresome traveler, it's where there's just no curiosity. It's like the food here's stupid and they drive on the wrong side of the road. My judgment is final. It's like you haven't even disembarked the plane, mate. Like, come on, just have some curiosity and ask some questions. There's a tension, right? Because we do have limited cultural information, right? Like, and things could be worse. Like, imagine if we were trying to read Daniel, but we didn't have any surviving apocalypses from the ancient world. Like,
Right.
we would be in a world of pain, and so things could be worse, but things could be better. We could be in the culture much more fluently. The hope that I hold out and it's partly in that definition which I gave of conventions. The good thing about conventions is that they're not contracts. They're not prior codes that we have to agree on beforehand in order to navigate. So in one of the major kind of philosophical descriptions of convention, they point out that you can arrive at coordination with another person in terms of coordination without prior agreement if the payoffs are sufficiently great and if you get multiple runs at it.
Mm.
So, for instance, if I didn't know that you guys drive on the right side of the road, my first day at SBL, I would very quickly receive bad payoffs for that in terms of like my head turned the wrong way, walking straight into traffic. Now, if I survive that first interaction, then the next time I cross the road, I can try something different, and hopefully I arrive at coordination on this question of what side of the road to drive on. Now, that's kind of a silly example, but when it comes to biblical literature, we do get, even though we've got a limited corpus, we do get multiple goes at reading it. And so one kind of phrase that I use is the boomerang test, which is, like boomerang, it's Indigenous Australian tool for hunting. It's a stick you throw, it's curved, it comes back to you if everything goes well. How do you know that you've got a boomerang? How do you know your boomerang's working? Well, give it a throw and see what comes back. And that's sort of my advice to people in terms of genre and the Old Testament. You can't have all your kind of questions answered in advance always. So sometimes you just have to try reading a text as something and see if the text plays along. Because we are in this, Gadamer would say we're in this sort of circular hermeneutical relationship with an other, in a dialogue, in a multiple interactions. And so you can revise your assumptions going in based on what the text gives you back. So if you read Daniel as a love story, or you read, Genesis as I'll be more controversial. Genesis as like kind of scientific account of the creation of the universe. Weird stuff happens. Like the text just kind of gives you back nonsense at some points,
Right.
and so that causes you to go, well, something's weird about this. Maybe I've got onto the wrong foot with this text. Let's try something else. And if the payoffs, the next time you throw the boomerang, if the payoffs come back a bit better, then that is strong evidence that you've actually aligned better with what the game the text is trying to play, if you like. Now, you may decide you don't care what the original audience would have thought of this text. You might say you don't care whether what the text brings back makes sense or not. But if you do care, and I'm quite fond of the Bible, actually, I quite like it, so I really want to get the most out of it. If your reading gets better, like it makes more sense, then my strong bias is towards follow that thought. Whereas if the reading makes no sense, if the payoffs are confusing, like in Genesis 16, like example with Hagar, the story makes no sense as an exemplum. Like it just the whole like why the angel says so much stuff which is not to do with being a runaway slave, why she thanks the angel and says, God's finally seen me. Like it just doesn't make sense in terms of the payoffs for that reading. Whereas it makes a whole heap more sense read as sort of a Hebrew narrative, which is kind of showing, not telling, and is tied in with the rest of the canonical story of Israel. So that's my strong bias. Give it a throw. Give the boomerang a throw. See what comes back, and that will help you in repeated interactions. That will help you achieve coordination, hopefully, with the text.
Yeah, we like to say, we're thinking about the deep structures in the text, and I'm trying to figure out in my mind right now whether genre is a deep structure or framing, or I don't know what the metaphor would be here. But in the same way with your road analogy, I think right-handed driving is a deep structure in American car culture, right? So like it's not just the roads and the paint on the lines. It's like the turn lanes, how they edge the curbs when you're turning right versus how you turn left. There's all these other coordinated features that kind of lock into place once you give assent to like, oh, we're doing the right-hand side of the road, not the left. By the way, that you said that you can kind of work with the text to see what happens. The only time I'm scared when I drive in the UK is when you're out on a road by yourself and there's nobody around you. And I swear, I stare at the road and try to figure out, I'm like, is it the right or the left side we're supposed to be on? Because when other cars are on the road, it's very easy to coordinate your dance with them, right? It's when there's nothing, no structures there. Does that ring true that we're looking at this is part of the deep structural analysis of the biblical text?
Yeah, the way that linguists talk about it is it regulates features of language at every other level, which is, I think, the same thing that you're saying, right? Because genre sits at the level of the context of culture, all the other things fall into place right down to the level of vocabulary. Now, in some examples, they don't, right? So the John Piper example is sort of horrific because everything lines up perfectly in both genres, and there's no clue. It's clear to John Piper that they don't understand that there's something wrong, but it's not clear to them because he just seems like a straight man. But apart from like some really edge cases like that, very quickly you realize, wait, why are all the cars parked backwards in this lane? Like, like that, just little things, just why?
Terrifying things to realize in the moment.
Those little things just don't fall into place. And that is a trigger. If you're attentive to it, that is the text. I mean, Gadamer talks about the text pulling you up short. Now, you can be just bloody minded about that and just push on through. So many stupid drivers in Boston today. That's like the 1,000th car that's beeped at me for no reason. But if you're attentive to the text pulling you up short, then those puzzles go, oh, hang on, why this has always bugged me about this text. Why doesn't that make sense? And if you follow that thread, then sometimes that whether we call it a deep structure or it's it's regulating from the context of culture down into the other layers. I think that's exactly right. There's 1,000 little things that make more sense when you're in the right genre. Yeah.
I think now that I hear you explain it that way, I think that clarifies. I would put genre more. I like it's the regulating feature, and that allows you to then see the deeper structures that I think I'm typically more focused on. I try to nail the genre issue. Is there, are there some typical passages you go to where you can say, like, look, here's where genre is going to help, or where people miss the genre and they push straight on through. Obviously, the exemplar problem, which is pretty amazing. When I see people trying to use, again, like Judges 19 or anything Abraham does, quite honestly, I sense that their organizing feature, their regulating feature is, why would God give us anything other than good examples to follow, right? So we got to squeeze blood from the stone. So what's somewhere where, like, you see people stumble on genre and it creates those kind of problems and they're not attending to the clues? Because if I hear you correctly, in some ways genre is like your spouse looking at you and saying, you're not hearing what I'm saying. Like, I know you're hearing the words, but you're not hearing what I'm saying because you're taking them the wrong way. And Scripture can do that to us as well.
Yeah, I mean, I teach survey courses often for undergraduates, and so we get to go through week by week. And the ones that are least familiar are things like apocalypse.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to start a cult, then just go ahead, read Revelation or Daniel as straightforward history.
Right.
Just do it. And like you will end up starting a cult. Like some of the famous kind of doomsday kind of cult, or like the Lord is going to return on this date, and we're all going to gather around, and seriously, he's coming this time. What's going on there? Well, they're taking a text which is a real thing and a bit of a weird thing. Like apocalypses only really exist for a fairly short period of time over history, and they have very unique rules, and I would argue very unique social functions. And we aren't really in that zone, but it's close enough to our mental model of prophecy or something that you can really get into trouble with the numbers, and because all those details about like what does a number mean in an apocalypse, well, it's quite different to in a history. I think that would be a big one. I think a more subtle example is actually letters. So the example I use from when we're teaching epistles, they occasionally let me loose on the New Testament at Ridley. It's a bit dangerous, but no one's died yet. When Paul, I start by asking the class, like you're Bible believing Christians. We're at evangelical seminary. You all would, if the Bible tells you to do something, you do it, right? Absolutely. Okay, well, you're a bunch of backsliders because Paul says to bring my scrolls and the parchments, right, and have nothing to do with that metal worker Alexander. So, hands up if you have a welder in your life called Alex. You are in breach. Right? Hands up if you have brought the scrolls with you today. I mean, no one here. What a bunch of backsliding Anglicans. It's exactly what I'd expect. So that's an example where, well, hang on, we tend to treat epistles just as like divine commands, but then except we get to those bits at the end of the letter, it's like, oh, well, obviously that doesn't apply. But a letter is an occasional work. It's written for a particular problem, into a particular situation with a particular audience. Now, it also has relevance to us, absolutely. But you have to kind of go through that process of understanding. I had a guy talk to me who was about to leave our church because our music pastor wore a hat. And he thought it was dishonoring to Jesus for a man to pray and prophesy with his head covered. Now, I don't want to make fun of him. My main concern is how people responded to his pastoral problem, because it was genuine. He wasn't being a jerk. He was just distressed by, here we are, Bible-believing church, loves Jesus, but yet we have up the front someone clearly disobeying Scripture. The response he got from his small group leaders was, you don't have to worry about that stuff. Doesn't matter. We don't follow that stuff anymore, which he thought was just wildly, selective and unjustified and frankly kind of hypocritical, because in the very same letters we take some verses as like, here's the hill we're going to die on. My problem with not with his question, but with the response that he received from his small group leaders, is that the true answer is not that we just ignore some verses of Paul's letters. The true answer is that we put all of Paul's letters through that genre kind of understanding of what's the situation he's writing into, how do the principles that he's addressing his audience apply to us today. So that's a few examples. Starting cults, leaving your church,
Right.
it all, these are serious issues.
There's practical payoff, and it makes me think. So recently, in the last few years, we've had somebody in the Old Testament studies side who has written a fairly influential book that essentially asked to obliterate genre. Like let's just get rid of the wisdom genre in this case, right? And then you could also. I've had students that they learn about genre and then they come, like chiasmaniacs and parallelomaniacs, and everything is like, well, you can't say anything until you figure out what genre it is, right? I'm going to assume we have some via media somewhere in the middle here that's going to match. But let's start with what's wrong with the idea of like, hey, knowing genres isn't helpful at all, or you don't need to know this in order to still figure all of this stuff out. Like Christians before they learned of genre studies were still Christians who could faithfully read the Bible, presumably.
Yeah. It's like, I just do the plain reading of the text. I don't need any of this hermeneutic stuff.
Right.
So like one of the famous influential preacher where I grew up is like, you don't need to interpret the Bible, you just need to obey it. That was his banner. And there's something deeply like right about that, in the sense that interpretation genre can become an excuse just not to engage with the content. Like we don't want to spend all that. I mean, as much as I feel personally targeted by your extreme case of the genre maniac, we kind of want to avoid that. But the problem is, and this is always the problem in hermeneutics, I'm making explicit what you are already doing when you read the text. You already have in your head a genre in mind. So we're not getting rid of genre by not talking about it. It's just you're interpreting it according to the rules that seem obvious to you and to people from your context, which may be fine. And like a lot of the time, the difference between an ancient letter and a modern letter is not that great. So yeah, no one will die. You'll probably work it out. But often enough for it to be worth writing a book about, those differences really, really, really do matter, because we are in another culture and we're assuming something about that literary culture. We're assuming that Old Testament narratives are like modern novels, or that Old Testament histories are like, a record of World War II or something, when I would argue they're really much more like prophecy or prophetic history or historical prophecy than they are like records of, Australian politics or something. So my argument always with hermeneutics and genre in particular is no one is without genre. No one is actually giving up on genre. It's just whether we want to be unconscious and unthoughtful about genre, or whether we actually want to bring those differences and those assumptions to the surface and interrogate them. Now, when you're reading in your native language, in your native culture, you don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about what is the genre of a news article, what is the genre of a parking ticket. It is just instinctive. But because we're reading a really old book, I would argue we have to be explicit about we have to slow down. And really genre studies is just a way of slowing down and saying, hey, what did I think this thing was? And is that right?
Right. And when you're reading the newspaper, it's like trying to explain water to fish. If you're trying to explain the genre of a newspaper or a tabloid or something, it's like, yeah, of course I know, right? Well, someone 1,000 years, actually 200 years from now, if they dig that up, they might not know. And it might take them a while to figure out what exactly is the purpose. I mean, to wit, we're still trying to figure out what the genre of the pyramids in Giza are. Like, are they death, related with death and burial, or something else? Or, giant power plants for the early aliens? It's difficult to tell from just looking on the outside.